the notion of reality and the way we grasp reality as humans is so deeply subjective, but it's also socially constructed. And so, as a filmmaker, and this is relevant because I'm also a Zen Buddhist, from both those perspectives, I really try to explore um, what what we perceive as reality, to untangle and figure out in what ways are we being deluded, and in what ways do we have clear vision. And obviously the more clear vision we can have, the better actions we take to ensure a more compassionate, just, and sustainable, livable world. So I'm all for sort of untangling the delusion, while admitting wholeheartedly that to untangle it fully is impossible.
Another episode of the Conscient podcast. I'm with Jennifer Abbott, who's on the West Coast, so it's a bit earlier there. Welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Well, we haven't met, but I've seen your film, and of course I've seen both of the corporation films. So you're a very prolific filmmaker, but you made a very particular film that's, I think, going to be the focus of our conversation around ecological grief and your own personal experience and the role of art and all that. But let's start just by getting to know you a bit more. Who are you, and what do you do?
Well, I guess I've been a socially engaged documentary filmmaker now for over 25 years. So, I got into filmmaking really because I clearly identified that I wanted to do something both creative and political. And so it was a very deliberate choice. And I started by going to film school. And then at film school, I realized, I can just teach myself. And so I just started to make my first feature documentary, which was A Cow at My Table, released in 1998.
Mm. And then you went on to do the corporation. You were co-director of the corporation film. So maybe tell us a bit about that, because that's also part of your history.
Yeah, I got involved with the first corporation film after Mark Akbar saw A Cow at My Table and really appreciated it. And at that point, he actually was working on a different film called Two Brides and a Scalpel, Diary of a Lesbian Marriage, which was about the first legally married lesbian couple in Canada. And they became legally married because one had sex reassignment surgery. And that's how they became the first legally married lesbian couple. Anyway, we worked on that together, and Joel and he had come up with the idea to make the corporation film, and I had actually I had done a degree at McGill University in political science, focusing on radical political thought, women's studies, deep ecology, and all of these issues were, in my view, the most urgent social, political, environmental issues of our day. So I got involved with the corporation and ended up co-directing it with Mark and editing it, which was, I will never quite wrestle to the ground another monster of a film like the first corporation. As an editor, I edited it from 400 hours of footage. So it was just a spectacularly vast project and film, both to co-direct and to edit. And one of the reasons why I refused to edit the sequel. But 17 years later, we embarked on the sequel, and I co-directed that with Joel Bakken.
Nice. Well, let's start with the notion of reality, which is very broad and vast. And the reason I'm interested in it is partially because of the notion of denial, because people sometimes have trouble accepting the reality of, they say, climate emergency. How does that respond to you as a topic or as a theme, the idea of reality?
Well, I think that it's all of my work actually attempts at its core to make the familiar strange, which sounds perhaps like an indirect answer to your question, but for me it's very, very relevant in the sense that the way we perceive so-called reality is obviously deeply, deeply embedded in so many things. We can hardly even identify all of them, right? Like in terms of our life experiences and uh, our cultural indoctrination, and even our somatic um, experience on this earth, right? So I just think that notion of reality and the way we grasp reality as humans is really obviously it's so deeply subjective, but it's also socially constructed. And so, as a filmmaker, and this is relevant because I'm also a Zen Buddhist, from both those perspectives, I really try to explore um, what what we perceive as reality, to untangle and figure out, you know, in what ways are we being deluded, and in what ways, do we have clear vision? And obviously, the more clear vision we can have, the better actions we take to ensure a more compassionate, just, and sustainable, livable world. So I'm all for sort of untangling the delusion, while admitting wholeheartedly that to untangle it fully is impossible.
The definition of reality in Buddhism. Buddhism seeks to address any disparity between a person's view of reality and the actual state of things. Right. Well, that makes sense to me because I'm also a Zen practitioner, and every
Okay.
day my teachers, talk to me about reality and that the moment is the only thing that we have, and those notions. But for me, it was like more of a societal question, like why are we so struggling so much with accepting the fact that the climate change situation is what it is already, and it's not always about denial. It's also just about not being able to absorb that information. The scientists are screaming it out loud. So that brings me to your film, because the magnitude of all things. When I saw it, I cried. But then a lot of people might cry in films that are very touching, like that one. But it was at the end when you brought together your personal experience with the climate disruptions, and the use of words and image and sound were very powerful, and probably, I would think, difficult because you had to kind of relive that experience. But maybe from the beginning, tell us about the film, how it originated and what it's about, so that people can understand your journey in and around ecological grief and grieving of the lost one.
Okay. And can I backtrack a little as well? Because
Sure.
I misunderstood your first question, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, like when we say reality, for me, that's just such a complex, uh, you know, uh, idea. And in terms of why people are so often unable to accept the reality of climate change, I will say I think it's very understandable, because the scale and the violence of it is just so vast. It's difficult to comprehend, and it's also so depressing and enraging if one knows the politics behind it, um, and overwhelming. So, I don't think we as a species deal with things that have those qualities very well, and we tend to look away. So, I think, I have a lot of compassion, including for myself. I mean, I include myself in that category in terms of how difficult it is to come to terms with the climate catastrophe. I mean, it is the end of the world as we know it. We don't know what exactly the new world is going to look like, but we do know we're headed for some catastrophes and already embedded in some. So, anyway, um, I feel that it is a very, I don't think that as a species we've ever had to come to terms with this. Yes, as cultures we have. So many of the First Nations, their worlds ended as they knew them when colonization happened. So we have instances of of this happening, but in terms of on a global scale, we don't. To answer your other question, with the magnitude of all things, uh, it came about exactly as I explain at the beginning of the film. I was developing another film about climate change, and I was in my garden on Salt Spring Island, and I literally looked up, and there's these little flakes falling from the sky that I thought at first were snow, but it was July. And the sky, there was also just this beautiful flame painted sky, and I knew both were being caused by a nearby forest fire. So I did a double take. Oh no, it's not snow, it's actually ash from this fire. And then in that moment, I did recognize the feeling I was experiencing was grief. And then because my sister had died a few years earlier, I went, aha, this feeling is similar in tenor, but different in intensity to the feelings of grief I had when I lost my sister. And so that was the moment that I wanted to make a film about the psychological and emotional dimensions of the climate crisis. I mean, I really believe, and I'm certainly not alone, that one of the reasons we've made such pathetic progress in terms of addressing this catastrophe is because we're not dealing with the emotional and psychological sides of things. And I wanted to explore that viewpoint.
Environmental Humanities Professor Jennifer Atkinson. Eco-anxiety and climate grief are sometimes framed as disorders. But in fact, these feelings typically arise from an accurate perception of our ecological crisis. It may be more appropriate to identify eco-anxiety as a moral emotion, a sign of compassion, attachment to life, and desire for justice. Our future remains unwritten, and by embracing the unknown, we are better able to reframe our thinking in empowering ways. And the film itself presents some of the world issues. You've traveled around the world and you documented. So it's a mix of documentary and a personal story. I guess what that brings to me too is the question about the role of the arts, because I've had some very interesting conversations about the role of the arts. What are your thoughts on the role of the arts? I mean, you're yourself a filmmaker and an artist. How do you think the arts can play maybe a more important role in the complex issues like the climate emergency? Artist Lance Garavi. While individual works of art, however genius, may have value, they won't do the trick. What we need is for all art to be about climate change.
Sure. Well, I'm a big fan of Amitav Ghosh's book, The Great Derangement, which, really says, why is every piece of art not addressing climate change today, just in terms in some way, just in terms of the magnitude of the changes we're about to embark on, and just how profoundly monumental they are in terms of every single human and non-human on the planet. So, I think there's a few ways I can discuss the arts and their role in terms of the climate discourse. On the one hand, I think it's vitally important that we make, films and write books and poetry and do art about the climate crisis, because that's where we'll find, I think, really authentic expressions of how we as a species are feeling, how we're coping, how we'll find resilience, where we'll see authentic hope, not hope as a form of denial. So that's one side of the equation, and the other side of the equation is I do really believe it's so important, even in these difficult and dire times, to celebrate life, right? And so, of course, I mean, music keeps me going right now. I have to say, and uh, poetry, and just to feel rejuvenated by and also to continue to have faith in humanity when so many sides, obviously there's many quite less than desirable sides of humanity being shown right now. And obviously I think art and music and films show us in many instances our best, which I right now in the time of crises, that's what we have to nurture. What is it that's the best in humanity, and how can we bring that out and amplify that side of who we are?
Well, certainly your film, The Magnitude of All Things, did that for me because it brought me into a sense of vulnerability or a sensitivity that might not have gone otherwise. And so I'd like to see it again, just to experience, especially that the end where it all comes together. But also when I saw the new corporation, I thought, how are they going to end this film? I mean, it's so dark at the beginning; it's unbearable, really. I had to turn it off once in a while to. Okay, we'll do another 10 minutes. And then you go through all of the positive, beautiful things that people are doing, some of them at a micro level, some at a macro level, that all combine together. I've stopped using the word hope, but it certainly give a sense of progress and momentum growing, especially in the younger generations of people. So how do you feel about hope these days? I know it's hard because of you've had to face realities through the filmmaking, seeing like in a way the worst of it, but you're also bringing a message of possibility anyway.
Yeah, well, I mean, as you know, one of the themes of the magnitude of all things is hope and an exploration of hope, but really I wanted to explore it in a more nuanced way. I mean, as filmmakers, we're really pressured to make films that are hopeful. And, there was Joel back in the co-director, and Peter Rowick, the editor of the new corporation, and myself, we were all very determined that, this moment in time calls for us to create a narrative arc in Act Two, which just goes deep, deep down, down, down into despair, pretty well as far as you can go. And we were really firm in our vision and determined to do that, wherein, people were saying, oh, no, you can't make it that depressing. It can't. But that for us reflects the current reality, to go back to that word. Um, and I'm really happy that we did, because then, the Act Three, which is the stories of resilience and resistance, you kind of rise from the ashes. With the magnitude of all things, there's the story of how my sister found hope while she was dying from cancer. And for her, she really recognized that being in the present and was the only real form of hope, that she was most alive in the present, wherein when she sort of forecasted in her mind what might happen in the future, which I think many of us do in terms of trying to envision a more hopeful future, she really recognized that that took her out of the present moment, and in some ways was a form of denial. And I think related to climate change, um, it can be a form of denial if you have hope that is unwarranted. which, if we look at the science, it's pretty bleak, but there's room for hope just in terms of action. So for me, hope is a verb, right? Hope is a practice. And that was the same for my sister. It was, just the very act of getting out of bed in the morning and doing everything possible to fight for climate justice or whatever it might be is in itself hopeful. And there's no need to know that one's actions are going to be successful or things are going to turn out. You just do it because it's the right thing to do. And for me, that's what authentic hope is. Hope is not some Pollyanna idea that everything's going to be okay, because I think that kind of hope prevents us from taking the risks and making the sacrifices that are really necessary and that are called for in this moment in time. So, I think both films are hopeful in their own way, but I would hope that they present a more nuanced conversation about this, really important human sentiment and its role in justice movements at a time where we are facing so many different existential crises.
Well, one of the persons that I interviewed recently was Seth Klein, who wrote the book A Good War, and I think you're familiar with it. He started with others a climate emergency unit, and I'm working with him and others, Angelia Padurai and others, to get the arts and culture communities better coordinated so that they have a stronger impact. And hopefully influence policy, influence the way that artists are trained, maybe, and tools to measure carbon footprints and all of those things that we probably should have done earlier, but we're getting to now, and hopefully in an accelerated way. And I think that the films that you make and other filmmakers and artists, some of them are working in this sort of speculative fiction kind of world. Others are working with very hardcore realities. But that sort of poetic approach to looking at an issue and looking at it from different angles, it is not only refreshing but necessary, but not in the kind of let's raise awareness kind of way, because the awareness is done. If people don't know about climate change now, they might never. But the arts can take it a step further. They need to walk their own talk, I think, but also, and I love the word you use, compassion for ourselves and our own suffering, our own grief is something that we need to also include in that. And some artists struggle to make a living, especially now in COVID era, where a lot of business models have been disrupted, some of them permanently. It's a tough time, but it's also a time of not only awakening, but of action, moving to actions that are meaningful and that have essentially a long-term vision, because we can't just resolve climate change and say we're going to be fine. As the New Corporation very clearly pointed out, the capitalist system itself is part of the problem. So how will artists tackle those things? Is I think in rapid change right now. I'm seeing it from coast to coast to coast, and I'm happy to see it. And I hope people will look at your work as because you've been doing it, you say, for a long time. So you've been sort of planting those seeds, and now they're coming into fruition.
Yeah, well, I couldn't agree more, and it's great that you're working with Seth Klein. I am a big admirer of that book and agree wholeheartedly with its thesis.
Well, it's a question of scale, I think, mostly. In fact, our movement is called Scale because we have to scale up to a large an extent that's unprecedented. And in the reality episode, I quote a bunch of people, and one of them is Rebecca Solnit, who writes eloquently about these things and talks about the notion of uncertainty. And uncertainty does open the door for the possibility of massive transformation of our society, and mostly by the younger people who are invested in it, but also the older people who can use their wisdom in ways that are empowering to others. That's something that I'm working through myself. Is what can I do? Well, it's one of the reasons I retired, is to do this kind of dialogue, but also get to action and have it to be as meaningful as possible. Writer Rebecca Solnit. Hope locates itself in the premises that we don't know what will happen, and that in the spaciousness of uncertainty is room to act.
Well, just with what you were speaking about with Rebecca Solnit, Joanna Macy also speaks about uncertainty, and the fact that we don't have certainty is in many ways a motivator to bring out our best. Because if there was any certainty, the motive, she posits that the motivation wouldn't be as strong, and in some ways the uncertainty and the mystery of the future um is sort of amplifies our effort. At any rate, I found that to be a fairly compelling argument.